Viewer discretion is advised.
Okay. So I decided to focus on specifically European fascism and forced birth because it felt close at hand. I don't know. Okay. I don't even fucking know. Okay. I'd like to begin with a quote from Anne Wingenter. I don't know how to say her name. Professor of History and Women's Studies at Loyola University. Quote, I think that reproductive rights are an important sign for democratic backsliding because I think they are a way in which the definition of the people in the whole notion of rule by the people gets narrowed. Some people get to be fully autonomous and some don't.
Yep.
So something that all authoritarian regimes, whether they be fascist or communist or somewhere in the middle, because it's all just one mobile strip that connects on the far ends. Mobius strip, sorry, that connects on the far ends.
Papier mâché.
Good job. That was a good catch. Something they all have in common is an obsession with controlling reproductive rights and women's bodily autonomy. And when I say women, I am including anyone who can get pregnant and give birth. But historically, that was limited to women. And so a lot of the statistics are limited to, quote unquote, women. But women asterisks. Okay. So I'm going to focus on 20th century Europe here, but this is just a small sample. We already talked about the ways in which the United States and other enslaving colonialist countries.
Oh, we're not done talking about that yet.
Brutally controlled women's reproduction.
We'll get to it in my segment.
I figured.
Depth.
Okay. So I recognize that, and Amanda will get to it. Okay. So societies seem to be most at risk of succumbing to authoritarianism in times of economic crisis and or political division and gridlock.
We have all of the above.
Yeah. There are going to be a lot of alarm bells that start to ring. So for Europe, the rise of both fascism and revolutionary Bolshevism, or like communism, occurred in the aftermath of World War I.
I said bullshitism.
I thought so too, but I was like, I like it.
Sure. Bolshevism, bullshitism, it's all the one. So tens of millions of people, many of them young men of like prime reproductive age, were killed in the worst war the planet had seen up until that point. And so the economies of especially like the losing countries were in shambles after World War I. There was high inflation and historically low birth rates. Fewer young dudes to fuck or get married. Folks are too poor, they can't support a kid. They get married later. All of those things, which we also have now. And this had elites in an absolute panic. So it is estimated, quote, Germany lost 12 to 13 million people because of World War I, or 1/5 of the nation's total population.
Are you talking about killed during the war or were never born as a result of the war?
Killed during the war, I believe. Not just from war, but from starvation, disease, everything.
So not like on the battlefield only.
Yeah, right.
As a result of the war.
Of the war, yep. Okay.
A lot of which was like disease. The loss of these Germans was not bolstered by the birth rate, which declined post-war and continued to decline throughout the interwar period. So the birth rate fell from 27.5 in 1913 to 25.9 in 1920 and to 14.7 in 1933, then the lowest figure throughout Europe. So it's no surprise that restricting reproductive choice was one of the very first moves of every European fascist regime. So Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. And at the time, the political landscape was extremely fractured. Basically, like the people on, even like in the center, but like center left and center right, fucking vehemently hated each other, could not come together to form a centrist coalition. And then they both had even more extremes on either side. So the extreme far left, there was a communist faction, and then the extreme far right was obviously the Nazis, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So even though Hitler never got more than 40% public support, public approval before he became chancellor,
The popular vote.
40%, he still ended up getting the reins, becoming chancellor. It's complicated, but it's because it was so fractured, and that's how he came to power. Okay? But he came to power legally.
Mm-hmm.
Right away.
Democratically.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well,
yeah. If
yeah.
you consider things like the Electoral College, which I know is not what they have, but Democrat.
Well, they had, yeah.
He was
like,
elected into power.
He legally won an election.
Yeah.
it's
without
it's
the
a little more
vote.
complicated than that because the majority couldn't form a coalition. And so as a minority party, he was able to be selected as chancellor.
Mm-hmm.
There were elections that got him to that point, but then that last point was actually just like a negotiation.
Got it.
But it's not like he was just propped up and put into power out of the blue.
No, it wasn't just like a military coup thing or whatever. It was like elections, gridlock, political party negotiations. Okay, we'll let him be the figurehead.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just saying that he came to power from the same in
legal means,
some of the same ways that we put our fascists into power.
Very similar. And the 40% thing should cause absolute alarm bells because apparently 40% of countries just like authoritarianism. I don't know. So right away, the Nazis began implementing a combination of policies to increase the white Aryan birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
These were, quote, a combination of punitive pro-natalist policies. For example, information about birth control. Giving information about birth control became a criminal offense, which some states are already talking about trying to implement, and that would go to the Supreme Court because of First Amendment issues. But, some states are already talking about it, criminalizing information about birth control and abortion.
Not even just contraceptive, but
there's
information about contraception.
That's already been around, the abstinence-only sex ed shit.
Sure, there's the Hyde Amendment, there's abstinence-only sex ed, but there's also, like, criminalizing someone just going on
the internet,
on social media and being
yeah.
like, this is how you could have you could self-administer an abortion at home with these herbs.
Mm-hmm.
Some states are trying to like criminalize that. Oh my God. So that went first. Abortion was already illegal, but it was basically just ignored.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't closely monitored. Like it's like it's always been. It's like people would figure out how to get themselves abortions and nobody criminalized that. Well, now the Nazis criminalized that. Quote, with women facing up to 5 years of penal labor for consenting to abortion. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In September 1935, so less than 2 years after Hitler came to power, the Nazis passed anti-miscegenation laws. Basically, the Aryans and Jews can't marry or procreate together. By December of that same year, Heinrich Himmler had already set up the Lebensborn program.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to get into the full horrors of the Lebensborn program in a minute. But first, I just want to compare and contrast how, like, the German, when there was still democracy in Germany, how they handled trying to increase the birth rate versus how an authoritarian and fascist regime handles trying to increase the birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
So Germany's Weimar Republic in the post-World War I years was also concerned about the declining birth rate, and they wanted to encourage citizens to have larger families. So they, quote, attempted to encourage motherhood through a host of social welfare programs.
Mm-hmm.
These programs included tax benefits, maternity leave benefits, increased health care to combat the high infant mortality rate.
Because it is the concern of a state's government to promote,
I guess
a healthy birth rate, I guess.
I mean, there are issues that will affect the nation if you have a wonky birth rate, but also every time you try to
Fuck with it.
fuck with the birth
You
rate,
find out.
Yeah, things can
Every
happen.
time you try to fuck around, you find out.
Yeah.
But hey, if you want to make sure that like babies that are born are surviving,
Fed and
infancy,
clothed. Yeah.
fed and clothed,
And that your main concern isn't just that they're boys or they're white or they're wealthy.
Yeah, if you just want healthy children or even just supporting
Living
children.
Living children.
And making sure that like people that have just given birth don't have to go back to work still hemorrhaging blood.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just about pregnancy. That's postnatal care.
Right.
People.
That's all fine.
Yeah.
But a lot of these programs of the Weimar Republic failed because they weren't inclusive enough and they weren't generous enough. So, quote, these programs did not, however, realistically encourage the majority of working women to have more children. The incentives given often excluded certain groups of women, and working women could not feasibly partake in all aspects of the programs because of working class lifestyles and financial concerns, end quote. So basically, the government only wanted to encourage middle and upper class families to have more children. They didn't want to actually help poor and working class families have a better way of life.
Yeah.
Because they still needed poor and working class women to work 12-hour shifts in the factory because all the young men were dead. And elites looked down their noses at the poor people and they didn't want, gross, more poor people being born. So they had these like tax benefits and maternity leave things, but only for certain women, only for the upper crust. Does that fucking sound familiar?
Yeah.
Like, oh, there's maternity leave, but only for full-time federal employees, and it's only paid this amount of time.
And like white collar jobs and
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all these companies that are getting all this attention on the news right now,
Disney.
are talking about Disney and Amazon, and they're going to pay for their employees to travel for abortion, blah, blah, blah. No, it's only for full-time employees.
Yeah. There's going to be plenty of red tape all all over that offer.
Yeah.
There always fucking is.
that is not a feel good story.
No, and there's
No.
like there statistically in the United States, for example, the majority of folks who collect on welfare are like lower, just below middle class white families, and it's because they obviously middle class families of any race deserve and need these services, but those parameters for qualifying for it exclude the most oppressed and the ones who need it the most because they don't meet any of the income requirements to receive all of those services. They might get like WIC, like very measly WIC.
Right.
That's about it. You're not going to access great healthcare through the state, and that's like doesn't matter. That's blue, red. That's how it fucking is.
How about children being taken from their biological families, not because of any like crimes or neglect or abuse, but just because the family can't afford them? The family is deemed too poor to afford them. So they're given to foster families, and the foster families are given funds to raise the child, but not the birth family.
Yep.
It's fine. Whatever. Okay. Back to the Nazis. So,
Oh, I thought we were still talking about that. I love the heavy-handedness so much. This was, you are in your stride right now.
I am right there. Okay, so quote.
You're going full Portland on this bad boy.
I'm just petting Jelly Beth and just waiting for this. I want to go back into my hole.
Let it wash over you. So,
I know.
Quote, for the fascists, the main role of women was to be mothers of many children, ideally the mothers of many future soldiers.
Yeah, that same ideology was
Birth
repeated
your children to send them off to death.
in
we'll
all of
get to that too.
the eugenics shit in the early 20th century. They looked, like I said, the Laughlin guy was going around and like seeing where people were from and like their lineage and whatever. It's like, well, these people have a horrible military. We don't want people from this area.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, God.
It's just about what that child can be in service to the state.
It's advantages to the state, period.
And when it comes to the Christian white ethno-nationalists here in the US, it's service to the church
Yeah.
and state. So you've seen a lot of these far-right people being like, well, if we have a higher white Christian birth rate,
Evangelical, for
Evangelical,
example.
exactly,
A
then,
casual example.
we'll be able to save the Republican Party from, immigrants, etc. Like, we'll be able to, like, spread the word of evangelical white fucking Jesus.
Yeah, it's just a dog whistle for eugenics.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1,000%.
So, like
Barely
I said,
even a dog whistle.
Not even
it's
a
the
dog-
loudest dog whistle of all time.
dog that will not stop barking, and you have to call animal control because their neighbors are neglecting it.
Right.
So, like I said, the 1933 to 1939 time period. So Hitler is in power, but it's not like full-blown World War II yet. This period, quote, was characterized by the suppression of the birth control movement, increasing restrictions on grounds for legal abortion, and severe penalization of performers of illegal abortions. Okay. Weird.
Severe, like, death?
Being sent to labor camps, losing medical licenses, being sterilized themselves because they're being deemed criminals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just a couple
Death,
things. Just to
death
name
penalty.
a few.
Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. Okay.
And then they kicked things up a notch with Lebensborn. So this translates to the Fount of Life. And it was a wide-ranging set of policies underpinning Aryan birthing centers.
Ick.
First in Germany and then throughout occupied territories. Basically, they were state-run birthing centers for mostly unmarried women who were pre-screened and deemed to be racially pure and healthy to give birth to Aryan babies. They were it's literally Handmaid's Tale. It's literally fucking Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
In these centers, and then those babies would be given up for adoption to Aryan German families, with the priority being given to high-ranking Nazi party members, of course, who wanted babies.
I mean, yeah, yes, The Handmaid's Tale covers that, but that's also like we did that during slavery here in the U.S. too. Like, it's nuts the lengths that fucking white supremacy will go to survive.
It is kind of important to talk about The Handmaid's Tale in this because, Black Americans have been going through this for generations.
I know.
Like,
I'm not saying that. I know that it's trendy now to bring up all of the things that are problematic about The Handmaid's Tale, although it was written in a time and place and it is a work of fiction. But I do think that as long as you recognize, like we have been, that all of this forced reproduction, forced birth, forced sterilization was happening to people of color on a wider scale and for a longer time period. As long as you recognize that, I think you can still draw a lot of lessons from a work of fiction like The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, for sure. I don't think that the majority of what I'm seeing is not even about pointing out the problematic nature of the book, because it's good, and I'm a fan of that book. I like the show,
and as long as it helps people recognize,
it helps people understand.
The feedback that I'm seeing mostly is from like Black and brown people is that it's harmful to them to draw from a work of fiction to make a point, to have to like draw in your fellow white people specifically, and not to be able to garner that reaction and that response from the very real world events that happened right here in the United States. It's not that the book is bad, and there are plenty of Black and brown creators I've been seeing online who also really like the book and just don't feel like it's an appropriate face
It's
of
really
this
not
It's like,
movement.
appropriate.
it has to
Right.
happen to you and people who look like you for you to
Exactly.
care.
That's exactly the issue.
And
that's,
it's not a dystopian novel. Like, oh,
It has
we'll
happened.
look at like the
Yeah,
indigenous
it's like-
population.
Exactly. And we'll get to those details, but that's what we're saying.
But and I've also ordered Parable of the Sower, which I've seen a lot of people recommend, which talks. It's like it's like The Handmaid's Tale, but it focuses on like very real harms that were perpetrated against people of color in a dystopian way. Anyway, so I've ordered that. I haven't received it yet. It's on back order, but. The reason I say
it's on back order.
it is.
I wonder why.
Yeah.
I love it.
Okay, so the reason I say it's like Handmaid's Tale is that it's literally fucking white, pre-screened, unmarried, healthy women brought to a birthing center to give birth to children that will automatically be adopted by high-ranking officials.
Right. It's just
That
the
is the
plot.
Handmaid's Tale.
It's just the
Literally.
plot. It's just the plot.
There's lots of red and white.
Maybe minus the full-on rape segment of that.
Doubt it.
Maybe.
I doubt that's.
There's
said
plenty of
maybe.
rape. There was coercion and whatever. So, okay.
I'm just talking about these birthing centers.
Right. In order to be like admitted to the birthing center, which a lot of women actually did apply for because it was a way to like have an income and like be taken care of, and not end up deemed antisocial by living from sex work or like being unmarried or whatever. So women would apply to join the birthing center. Or the Lebensborn program. Initially, the biological parents' ancestry on both sides, the mother and the father, was confirmed going back 3 generations to ensure that they were pure Aryan.
To ensure they were pure.
But later, this was eased somewhat, and they allowed for babies born to SS officers and their white foreign mistresses. So, like when they were in occupied France.
Wow.
Yep. Don't worry, baby. We don't need to use a condom. You can just be sent to this birthing center.
Woof.
Literally, yes. And so long as the babies were deemed racially valuable,
Oh, fuck.
meaning they looked Aryan enough and didn't have obvious special needs at birth, then they were kept. So if they, The birthing centers were located on property confiscated from Jews and furnished rather plushly.
Even better.
Right.
With confiscated furniture and belongings from Jews. And Himmler himself actually made it like his pet project. It was his special interest.
Oh my God. He
To
had a show on
design
HGTV.
The decor and the furnishings of the centers so that people would want to be there.
He had a Pinterest board.
He had a Pinterest board for designing the birthing centers
With
stolen property
stolen
from
Jewish,
murdered Jewish people. Yeah. And then, when the domestic supply of infants still wasn't enough, the Nazis turned to the inevitable next step, kidnapping blonde babies from occupied territories. So this was Lebensborn 2.0.
But how could they be sure of their pure lineage?
Didn't care. They just looked Aryan enough and they weren't special needs. But they would vet them, and I'll tell you what happened to the ones that were kidnapped and then
Decided
discovered
against.
to be impure.
Yep.
Oh my God.
So according to Himmler, quote, "It is our duty to take the children with us to remove them from their environment. Either we win over any good blood that we can use for ourselves and give it a place in our people, or we destroy this blood," end quote.
And the nose.
It's very similar to the Native American.
Yep.
The boarding
we'll
school.
get
boarding
to
schools.
We'll get to that.
So beginning in 1939, tens of thousands of children from countries like Poland, Yugoslavia, Norway, basically countries deemed white and blonde enough, were kidnapped from their biological families and brought to Germany. There, they began the process of Germanization in boarding schools, and this was for older children, so kids above the age of 6.
Older children.
They wouldn't kidnap. They would kidnap up to the age of 12. Because nobody wants after 12.
A teenager. Yeah.
Well, they're all washed up at that point.
And between 6 and 12, they would go to the boarding schools because they were less desirable for adoption. So they probably weren't going to be adopted, but they were still malleable enough that we can turn them into good German cannon fodder. And under 6, they were kidnapped and pretty much adopted right away. Children who were kidnapped but later deemed unfit through the screening process were not returned to their parents because that would be too tricky.
That's not kidnapping.
Yeah.
Follow through.
Instead, sent to labor and concentration camps. Yeah. So if you were kidnapped and then they were like, you know what, actually.
So if you were non-Jewish, Aryan-looking, non-handicapped, blah, 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 seemingly in line with your Nazi occupiers, they could still kidnap your Aryan-looking child, and then if they decide they didn't want it, still send them to a concentration camp.
Yep.
I'm just making sure I got all that right.
Yeah, forced labor, but
this.
Yep.
Got it.
So, and a lot, especially like Polish, like Poland was really fucked over during World War II. A lot of Polish kids were kidnapped. For Aryan German women or, Aryan women in the occupied territories outside of the Lebensborn program, so those who didn't apply and weren't like sent to the fucking birthing centers, there were still extremely harsh penalties for abortion of quote unquote healthy, racially valuable children. Quote, special courts in Vichy, France and Nazi Germany were authorized to impose the death penalty for illegal termination of unwanted pregnancies, which is being called for in many states in the U.S. today. And they carried out their mandate. So people were put to death for accessing an abortion of an Aryan child.
But if it wasn't Aryan, they didn't give a shit.
If it wasn't Aryan, they'd be forced to abort.
Ah, okay. Got it.
Yeah. So, of course, during these crackdowns, illegal abortions actually increased abruptly from pre-war rates because they also couldn't access contraception. And all of these abortions were now illegal, so illegal abortion went up like crazy because every time you ban it, you just create more illegal abortions.
Right.
The only government-sanctioned abortions were of children born to parents deemed to be racially inferior, so those were allowed, or deemed to have some other disqualifying trait, including what was then termed feeble-mindedness.
Yeah, that was a quote floating around in my research too.
Yeah.
And sexual perversion.
So after the war, during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi apologists pointed to American politicians' endorsement of forced sterilization as a justification for their own crimes. They literally are like, well, they were doing this in the U.S. for decades, so we're not any different from you guys putting us on trial.
So there are quotes from Hitler's speeches about like, well, we didn't start this. They're already doing this in America. Like multiple occasions.
Yep.
We are awful.
Sorry, I'm burping. The Nazi defense lawyers at Nuremberg really relied on that fact.
Yeah.
That the U.S. was also monstrous.
It was a precedence.
Yeah. So hundreds of thousands of people throughout Europe were forcibly sterilized for crimes such as failing a math or grammar test.
I'm out. Bye.
Like literally they would stand in front of like a tribunal.
You have to do math in front of an audience? I would be out in me. I don't think I could even make it on stage.
And just asked SAT questions, essentially.
No.
And if they took too long to answer or they answered incorrectly or whatever or were nervous, sent for sterilization.
What were those this is to this as this is to that?
Analogies.
Oh, those never made sense to me. Not not even once.
Also, it's a very
Amanda gets
agrarian society. A lot of people didn't go to school past 6th grade.
Right. So how are
It's
they
not their fucking fault that they don't know grammar.
Yeah.
Well, right. There's so much about academia that's just not culturally applicable depending on what street you grew up on, what industry your family works in, all this shit. What fucking
Who are you to say this is a smart person or not?
These kids are helping their families survive along
on the farm or in the
farming
bakery
winter,
or
and then you don't know analogies and advanced calculus, so we're gonna give you a forced vasectomy or
which is
tie your
far
tubes.
less useful than how to grow corn.
It's ridiculous.
Especially in a post-war or during war.
It's also capitalism. We don't value the lower class, but we need them to survive.
Right.
Great.
Right. So failing a math or grammar test, having a criminal record, or having a family member with a criminal record.
I'm out. 2 for 2.
Being mentally
I'm so
ill.
out.
3 for 3.
Or being seen as being at risk of becoming mentally ill.
4 for 4.
So
mentally iller.
there is an example of a German woman who the state targeted for sterilization because her grandfather had died by suicide.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
for
eugenics.
fuck's sake.
They don't want that.
Yes,
they don't want a history of mental illness in your bloodline.
Yes.
Which also found out my paternal grandfather died by suicide. So I just wouldn't have lasted long.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Would have been like, have you seen the eyes though? Have
I
you
was
seen
just
them?
going to say, but my eyes.
It's the Bucinator. I mean,
being categorized as asocial, so that's what a lot of Roma and Sinta people were categorized as and murdered.
Gay people.
Or forced sterilized gay people, political opponents, pacifists.
Oh my God.
Yep,
so
the list goes on.
most people.
I'd be so out.
Oh, yeah.
So bottom line, like we've said, control of reproductive rights and eugenics are two sides of the same coin. They're the same thing. So those were the sticks, if you're thinking about a carrot, policy being made up of carrots and sticks. But the pro-forced birth policies also included carrots. So the Nazis implemented rewards for German mothers who birthed and raised 4 or more deemed fit children for the fatherland.
Wow.
They were literally given a medal.
Jesus Christ.
And
I
there's
love a good party, but relax.
A picture of this on the drive. It is called the Cross of Honor of the German Mother.
Ugh.
Oh,
your more candy.
Pictures are horrible. Ew, it's ugly too.
Well, yeah, it's fascist.
Oh no. Did they have to all be boys?
No, they just had to be white and not special needs and
Aryan looking enough?
yeah.
Ugh.
Jesus Christ.
Go barfo to that medal.
Ick.
Hot take.
I'll go barf.
barf.
Hot take. We don't like this Nazi medal.
Do not. 0 out of 10.
It's
hated it.
Uggo barfo.
I give this medal 10 Uggo barfos.
Oh my God.
Jesus.
Similarly,
Someone has to laugh or I'll just die.
I mean, now I'm laughing.
10 out of 10 Uggo barfos.
so similarly, in Mussolini's Italy, quote, women's reproductive autonomy was a central concern for the Italian fascist regime. Women's fertility became a public good that belonged to the state.
Yeah.
Explains Professor Diana Garvin of the University of Oregon.
Here we are. Welcome to the U.S. in 2022.
Mussolini's regime implemented a set of laws known as the Rocco Code, which restricted access to birth control, even knowledge of birth control methods, so even talking about birth control, which mainly, quote, targeted midwives as they were the primary source of information about contraception and options for getting an abortion.
We're going to get to all of this. They are playing from the chattel slavery and civil war in America playbook. This is all, it's nuts.
It's all one thing.
Well, that playbook has existed for millennia.
Well, I know, but these are specific propaganda campaigns that were
Targeting
run in the
midwives.
United States
Yeah.
that long before this And they've already, like, the Nazis have already said that they've been borrowing our tactics. Like, this is it all just fucking repeats.
It's all the same.
The fascist state also implemented, quote, incentives for reproducing more often, with financial rewards given to women who birthed 6 or more children.
Oh, the tearing.
And literal parades were put on to honor such Italian mothers.
Wow.
They had to march in parades.
My God.
So
that's actually a horrible punishment.
Yeah. Most of us know how fucked up Germany and the other Axis powers were during World War II, but how about an even more recent example from the other side of the political spectrum, still in Europe, still authoritarian?
Mm-hmm.
I think I've talked about Nikolai, I can never say his name, Ceausescu? Ceausescu. Nikolai. We're going to say Nikolai.
Okay.
The communist dictator of Romania. I've talked about him before on the show because he's an absolute doozy, but this is just the quick and dirty about his abortion policies. So for context, he's the communist dictator of Romania. Before 1967, the Romanian abortion policy was one of the most liberal in Europe. Because the availability of contraceptive methods was poor, abortion became the foremost method of Romanian family planning, end quote. So abortion was very common. They didn't have a lot of access to birth control. It's a very poor country. It was legal and common, and it was used as a form of birth control because that's all they had.
Yeah, which is what I referenced in my segment, but we have ostensibly a whole gamut of other resources for contraceptives.
But Romania's birth rate reached the lowest level on record in 1966, and the dictator was obsessed with increasing the future communist workforce. So you know where this is going.
I do. I really do.
In October of that year, Nikolai published Decree 770, which outlawed both abortion and contraception for all women under the age of 45.
45?
Later, it was lowered to 40, then it was brought back to 45. And they carved out some exemptions for women who had already done their duty to the motherland by birthing 5 or more children.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the
5
for that
5 or
recognition.
more.
That's great.
So the state's grip on women's reproduction was near absolute because it's also a communist dictatorship. So these policies foreshadow some of our modern day concerns about digital privacy and like digital tracking, and how everything about our like private health concerns is it's much more public now than it ever has been before.
And vulnerable
Unless you're like extremely careful.
It's technically all on the dark web. So if you're able to access the dark web, it's not a far reach.
Everything can be tracked now. Like we buy everything with credit cards or online. They can know when you're buying tampons, when you're not buying tampons, when you're buying a pregnancy test, when you're not, blah, blah, like all this shit, right?
Well, there was some app. Oh, God, I forgot what it was. This was several years ago. Like, this was a while ago. But this, like, teenage girl, like, her family discovered that she was pregnant out of...
Oh, because of targeted ads or something?
Because of ads
Target.
from Target.
Yeah.
Like, her dad went and used, like, one of the same
Yeah,
cards
and it
or
spits
same
out
account.
the coupons or
and
whatever.
the coupon, and, like, several coupons were, like, you know, pregnancy
prenatal
tests
vitamins.
and prenatal blah, 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 blah. And he was like adding things up. He's like, are you fucking pregnant? And that's how they found out that their daughter was pregnant.
Yep.
And so that's just accidental. Think if it was used intentionally and like with malice.
Trying to figure out, or part of a prosecution.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Trying to find evidence.
It's all there.
So that's modern day, but the way it happened back then in the 60s in Romania, quote, there was workplace pregnancy testing to ensure women didn't arrange abortions for themselves.
Jesus Christ.
Workplace pregnancy tests. It's like drug testing.
Yes. Of course, women still got abortions, and they actually had the highest number of deaths from illegal abortions in all of Europe. Decree 770, quote, gifted Romania the highest maternal mortality rates in Europe. And I think that excludes people who died from illegal abortions. I think that just includes like women who were giving birth.
Mm-hmm.
And a generation of emotionally afflicted, malnourished orphans raised in miserable conditions, end quote. And I do mean miserable conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So Romanian orphanages, severely overwhelmed and underfunded, could not cope with the influx of so-called orphans, most of whom their parents were still alive, but they couldn't afford to keep them, and they couldn't get rid of the pregnancy. And so they just had to give up these children to orphanages. They became notorious for overcrowded, unsanitary conditions.
Can you imagine the heartbreak as a parent?
No.
I mean, even if this was an unwanted pregnancy, let's just say, you still carry the baby, you give birth, then you have to give that baby up. You have whatever, and then
you have an emotional connection.
I mean, yeah, I'm not going to presume that, but yeah,
you might.
One might.
Regardless, this is,
and then you know that it's in these conditions.
This is just trauma of an
it's unnameable. It's a
massive degree.
Unnameable evil. This is so fucked up.
So, I mean, tons of studies have been done about Romanian orphanages. It's its own horror. It's its own like subgenre of horror. But in these orphanages, babies learned quickly that no one would respond to their crying because they were so understaffed. So they just fell silent.
They just stopped crying.
They stopped crying because they weren't ever going to be responded to.
Oh my God.
So they were just silent. Rooms full of babies.
That's horrific.
According to one witness, quote, they lay under once white blankets in little glass boxes like museum exhibits behind glass. The room was as quiet as a provincial museum. At the time, having little experience of babies, I did not realize that the lack of crying was a sign of emotional deprivation, end quote. Abuse was rampant. Children in the orphanages were physically restrained and tied to beds. They were forced to like sit in their own urine and feces for hours, days at a time because we're understaffed. They weren't able to change them all. Many died of commonplace and treatable illnesses, just like the flu or
a cold,
anemia or whatever. Many starved to death. Like they were just neglected. There weren't enough people working to care for all these just rooms with just beds, and every bed, multiple kids. They had severe developmental and cognitive impairments from lack of social emotional support or like any contact. So like most like never learned to speak, or like very, very limited verbal skills and cognition. Like just it's basement boy stuff. It's estimated that 500,000 children were raised in these conditions in Romania because of these policies, all of which was fucking preventable. Most never recovered from the treatment they received in these state-run institutions. It's something that Romania is still dealing with today. And this figure doesn't even include the children who weren't like formally given up for adoption because nobody was fucking adopting because everybody was poor, but like given up to these orphanages. Lots of children like stayed with their families for a while, and then the families like couldn't afford to keep them or were shuffled into like even worse poverty. And then these children ended up on the street. All of which was preventable. And we know that because literally, quote, in the first year after abortion was legalized again in Romania, the maternal death rate fell by 50%. And like literally all these problems just
started to
resolve. It's fucking horrific. And there's so much more to be said, but like that's my fucking segment. It's like We've seen this all before in a lot of places. And if you think that this is not what's happening here, or you think that it can't happen here, like, you're fucking naive.
It happened. It just didn't happen to white people here. But it has happened and has been happening here for a long fucking time.
And now it's just happening to more people.
It's just getting worse. Yeah, it's just getting worse. So, like, the time to fight against this was a long fucking time ago, but it's never too late to start. So we need to fucking get started.
Yep.
You okay, La?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I sure hope you liked that clip. If you did like that clip, make sure you are subscribing to our YouTube channel, leaving us a nice review, and joining us on Patreon for even more video content, audio content, salacious content all around. Come join us. Treat yourself.